In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson introduced one of the most transformative and, for its time, one of the most divisive pieces of legislation in US history. So today, July 2nd, 2024, on the 60th anniversary of this pivotal moment for America, I want to know, what is the Civil Rights Act? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. Joining me on the show today is Dr. Nicholas Grant, a historian of 20th century United States and author of Winning Our Freedoms Together, African Americans and Apartheid 1945 to 1960. I'll pop a link to that in the show notes as well. His research focuses on race, internationalism and transnational activism. Hello, Nick.
Hi, Liam. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really good to have you back on the podcast. It feels like it's been too long, so it's nice to have you back. And our special guest this week is a senior lecturer in American history and culture at Canterbury Christ Church University. She's published work on the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter, and she's the recipient of awards that include the Macy King Distinguished Paper Award on Women, Gender and Black Politics. Welcome to the show, Dr. Althea Legal-Miller.
Thank you, Liam. And hi, Nick.
Hey, Althea.
I believe you two have crossed paths before, is that right?
We go way back.
The American Studies UK conference scene and various other kind of interactions. Yeah, so it's really, it's been way too long. It's really nice to see you.
It has.
Wonderful. Well, I enjoy being the third wheel in this conversation. But let's kick off, I guess, with a bit of a scene setting. Because, the Civil Rights Act didn't just come out of nowhere. LBJ didn't just wake up one day and think, hey, I'm going to sort out segregation. We probably don't have time for a complete history of racial tension in the US because that's a broad subject. But Althea, I wonder if you could kind of just outline some of the key events that led to the Civil Rights Act specifically.
Well, you're right. We don't have time to do the spread, but I'll do my best if you stay with me as I take you through this journey as quickly as possible. We can start with the election year. That seems quite fitting. It's 1960. It's an election. It's going to be the young JFK versus the incumbent Republican Richard Nixon. And JFK is looking to get the black vote. He is courting the black vote. And part of his campaign promises is to say, look what the administration has done before. Look at what Eisenhower has done for civil rights. Eisenhower passed a 1957 Civil Rights Act, then a 1960 Act, and they're pretty weak. And nothing is changing on the ground for African Americans. Kennedy says, elect me, and I'm gonna do legislation with a stroke of a pen. It can be done. I'm the person to do it. Vote for me. And African Americans do. 70% of African Americans vote for Kennedy. So, 1960, the 50s, we've seen a lot of civil rights activity. We've seen Brown v. Board, landmark Supreme Court case, where we've seen that racial segregation in school is unlawful. You've seen a major campaign, a bus boycott. The face of that bus boycott is Rosa Parks. And we have folks like Martin Luther King and Joanne Robinson who are working on that particular campaign. Year-long boycott, but successful. They dismantle that system of segregation on the buses in Montgomery. And you also have tragedy. We have a young teenage black boy who is murdered, Emmett Till, but that has a galvanizing effect for the community as well. So a lot's happening. Kennedy is inheriting all of this. So what's he going to do? Well, it was a narrow victory. Kennedy doesn't want to lose the support of the South. He doesn't want to lose that majority, that very slim majority that he has. And he says, I don't think I'm going to push for civil rights right now. I don't want to alienate the South. So he takes a back seat. This isn't what he promised. And indeed, he's thinking maybe strategically, I'll do 7 civil rights in my second term if I can get away with it, where things are safer. But history doesn't allow Kennedy to do that. There's a major campaign in 1963, which involves children and young people who face extreme police brutality on the streets of Birmingham, Alabama. And that played really badly nationally, but also internationally as well. And Kennedy is forced to act on civil rights. He makes a television address in the nation and says, I'm going to send a civil rights bill to Congress, and it's going to be strong. And no longer can the United States live in the way that it is, denying equality and human rights to part of its citizens. And here we have really the beginning of this bill, which now repeatedly fails. But it's 1963, and this is now coming up to the end of the line where we get to the bill. At 63, we have a lot of hope in the air, but also tragedy. So we have the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech, incredibly successful in terms of mobilizing, but again, putting pressure on the Kennedy administration. We also have a church bombing, kills 4 adolescent girls, injures 22 individuals. It's a KKK terrorism bombing. Again, the nation is saying, we've got to do something. This is out of hand. And then the biggest event of all, which really leads us on this path to this Civil Rights Act of 1964, you have the assassination of a president. And with that, we have LBJ walks into center stage. He is the president, and he says to Congress, the joint session, if you want to honor a slain president, why don't you pass the legislation that he's fought so hard for, the Civil Rights Act of 64? And there you have it. How do we honor our slain president but to push through this legislation? And there you have the beginning, major events. None of this could have been predicted, but you have the beginning of a fight to get this through Congress. But you are doing that with the momentum of a slain president.
Was there an element of just pressure on LBJ? You know, did he really want to do this, or politically maybe were his hands a little bit tied? Was it just, you know, tactically just the right thing for the Democrats to do? Because you said, you know, they you know, galvanized 70% of the African American vote, and I guess, is that a bad thing? They listened to their electorate, right?
In terms of hands being tied, I think we can see that Kennedy's hands is actually tied. That's how it gets this going. LBJ, in terms of, is it a tactical victory? LBJ says, we're going to lose the South for a generation. He was wrong. It was going to be a lot longer. The South is still lost. The South is solidly Republican to this day. So in terms of tactically, in terms of party politics, no, this wasn't a gain in that way. I'm going to say that LBJ was doing the right thing. There is a history of LBJ being pushed to do things that he doesn't want to do. And I'm not placing him as some kind of civil rights warrior. That's certainly not the case. But did he use leverage? Did he use tactics in order to get this bill? This was an incredible fight. As much as some of the debate was muted because of Kennedy's assassination, it was still pretty vicious behind the scenes. And LBJ is one of many individuals who is working the back doors, but he's also making speeches. He is also declaring to the nation that it's been over 100 years now of inequality, and it's not acceptable. We're going to move forward.
And, you know, Nick, I want to bring you in here because, you know, although it's good to sort of hear that you know, LBJ really did work hard to try and push this through. You know, you also mentioned, Althea, that, you know, that sort of fire was really lit by some of those sort of grassroots incidents and tragedies that occurred in the lead up to that, which really kind of put it on the national conscience and made it a big political issue. And it kind of begs the question a bit, you know, is it down to African Americans to have made that an issue and to have sort of, because it just kind of feels like if we didn't have those tragedies, if we didn't have those incidents, would the white people have cared? Because they weren't losing out from segregation and from the way things were. It feels like that onus is very much on sort of the oppressed here to force that change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you wouldn't have had the 1964 Civil Rights Act at the time that you did if it wasn't for the work of African Americans over a number of years and decades. And Althea does an amazing job there of like packaging up and showing all of that kind of groundswell of activism, all of those flashpoints. And that is caused and that happens because of the willingness of African Americans to put their bodies on their lines, to risk their safety, to risk their lives, to challenge segregation, Jim Crow, white supremacy. So, like, for example, like in 1960, you have the Greensboro Sit-In movement. And that's a massive shift because you have students willing to kind of put themselves in these segregated spaces and trying to desegregate it. And that really kind of explodes. And I think is a really key turning point in that 60s moment in terms of bringing people out onto the streets and kind of accelerating the civil rights movement. But Althea is absolutely right to point out that, this goes on much further back. It goes back to the 40s, it goes back to the 30s. And we've talked before in the podcast about this concept of a long civil rights movement. So yeah, absolutely. And I think LBJ is interesting, right? Because I agree with Althea, he does the right thing. He kind of takes a stand. And he does something that damages his own electoral prospects and the electoral prospects of his party in terms of losing the South and alienating the South because of his stand against white supremacy. But Althea also mentioned the 1957 Civil Rights Act, right? So the reason why that is so weak is partly down to LBJ because he's there as a pragmatist working on a compromise as a Southerner, saying, look, okay, we'll pass the Civil Rights Act. It will look good in the context of the Cold War in terms of burgeoning the United States' reputation as the leader of the free world. But what I'll make sure that's inserted into that bill is that if people are accused of racial discrimination or organizations or bodies are accused of racial discrimination, it will have to go to trial. And he knows full well that there'll be all white juries in the South. So that effectively nullifies the power of that bill. So he's not ideologically or morally committed to civil rights. He is a pragmatist, and his hand is forced by the actions of activists on the street.
Yeah, and I guess there's probably you could apply that to a lot of people maybe in government who are also working to push that through. And I guess regardless of intent and whatever the reasons were, it's good that there were a lot of people at the time that were doing the right thing and making sure that the Civil Rights Act got passed, I guess. But kind of on that note, Nick, I wonder if you could give a bit of a summary of some of those key figures that we may not know of who were sort of instrumental in the Civil Rights Act happening.
Yeah, I think from within government, obviously, we've talked about LBJ being a really key figure. I would say Robert Kennedy as the Attorney General, and the people who worked in the Department of Justice. They did really kind of interesting and important work, again, not without its shortcomings in terms of getting bipartisan support for the Civil Rights Act. And I guess you've got to give some credit to progressive Democrats and more moderate Republicans who supported that bill and ensured that it was signed into law and it passed the houses and became a law in the United States. Again, like without wanting to sound like a broken record, just pick up on something that Althea says is that this really was something that came because of the actions of African Americans that was politically opportune in a way. The Cold War context is really important here. That kind of essential idea that how can America have segregation, these instances of racial violence, and be the leader of the free world. The Soviet Union is always hammering away at that. And also because of the promises that Kennedy had made. So I think I don't want to cast these kind of white politicians as kind of heroic figures within all of this. Sometimes they are doing the right thing, but often their hand is forced, and sometimes they're kind of watering things down and being pragmatic. So Johnson and Robert Kennedy are signing off, allowing the FBI to wiretap key civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr. So again, I would slightly kind of switch the focus. I think often in the UK, where we're talking from today, there is an emphasis in terms of when people are taught the civil rights movement to find like who was the best president and that kind of thing for civil rights. I think that's a slightly kind of odd question, really. And again, we've got to focus on Martin Luther King Jr., the people that Althea was mentioning, but but also moving beyond Martin Luther King Jr., thinking about groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, and others, and to kind of really give credit to those organizers. So to think about people like Ella Baker, who we talked about in a previous podcast episode as well, Diane Nash, John Lewis, James Farmer, NAACP lawyers and field organizers, all of these people who kind of push people to take a stand on civil rights, who mobilize and organize people at a grassroots level, and who challenge segregation in the courts as well. So just to kind of reiterate that point, there's a really good kind of quote which I often use in teaching to kind of try and emphasize that this wasn't like benevolent presidents or benevolent forces within the federal government that ensured the Civil Rights Act. So after the March on Washington, which is July 1963, King kind of writes this article where he kind of asks what's next. And I've got a quote here. He says, "The hundreds of thousands who marched in Washington marched to level barriers. They summed up everything in a word, now. What is the content of now? Everything, not some things in the president's civil rights bill is part of now." So I think that stresses the urgency that activists were, the point that they were making and how urgent the point was making and how they pushed politicians and the federal government to do what was right ultimately.
It reminds me of the conversation that you and I, Nick, had with Gary Young earlier on the podcast when, we were talking about Martin Luther King and, history remembers him very fondly, but actually at the time, he wasn't a particularly popular figure, especially among white people, because he was antagonistic and he was forcing change, and he was doing what he had to do, but it didn't make him particularly well liked in the same way that he maybe is today. And Althea, I wonder if we could talk a bit about the kind of the impact of the Civil Rights Act. What was it that people like Martin Luther King and the other unsung heroes of that time were actually fighting for, and what was the legislation that actually passed?
Yeah, that too. You give me these big questions, but I guess just to pick up on what Nick was saying, naming those figures, particularly those figures that we don't talk about, is really important. But also the organizations. And I think that's helpful when we think about the models, using history as a model for today. It really is not about finding that charismatic leader who's going to blaze a path, but how are organizations working together and organizing. And the Civil Rights Act is really an excellent example of that. So you have a number of key individuals, but you have so many organizations working. Three key areas. You've got religious organizations, you've got the labor unions. Labor is so important to this. This bill doesn't happen without labor. And then, of course, you have civil rights organizations. The lobbying efforts, we're talking about 70 different organizations are lobbying politicians to make sure they push this through. Now, they don't all share exactly the same goals, and so there are different emphasis. So, for instance, the National Women's Party, they are lobbying to have sex classified as a protected class, for instance, and getting sex recognized in the bill. And they have a success with that. They have a success. Sex is a protected class for Title VII. I guess I'm jumping ahead of myself because you did also ask, well, what's in the bill? I won't go through it all, but in short, there are 7 titles. They all address different areas. A number of those titles will set up commissions and ways in which data could be gathered so that you can monitor discrimination in terms of race, color, religion, and national origin. And we do have the addition of sex for Title VII, which actually is about that is unlawful to discriminate in employment. Title VII is really difficult to pass. So, of course, labor unions are behind that. Civil rights activists are behind that. The March on Washington for jobs and freedom. So employment, super, super important across all of these different groups who are organizing, but also to women's groups as well. So Title VII addresses employment. The big one, Title II, it's unlawful to have racial segregation in public accommodations. So that's your restaurants, your swimming pools, your public libraries, etc. These public accommodations can no longer be segregated, and that's Title II. Really important that that is part of the bill. There's some areas that are less successful. Title I is voting rights. That's not successful. Yet again, a weak bill around voting rights. And we know
It's
that
still an issue
LBJ's
today, right?
hand, exactly, to this day, LBJ's hand is going to be forced to actually follow up the year later to address voting rights with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But you have these sweeping changes. You've got these big, quite landmark changes with, it's a mixed bag. Some are good, some are controversial, some are going to make this immediate impact. Like Title II is going to make an immediate impact. Surprisingly, it goes into effect quite easily with not too much controversy. A lot of folks in the South are already desegregating. Nick is absolutely correct. The Cold War context is important here. So there already was a commitment by the government to project a particular image of the United States. And part of that is dismantling racial segregation. Of course, racial apartheid is not playing well on the national stage in a Cold War moment. So a number of places in the South are already desegregating. But it does go through. Of course, there's a challenge. So the Supreme Court are going to take the challenge and they fast track it. And they agree that, no, Title II is constitutional. And so the South, the remaining parts that are still segregated in public accommodations, pretty much goes through, and that changes pretty straightforwardly. There's always an outlier. Maybe we can save the story of Lester Maddox for the behind the scenes. But yeah, there's always got to be one who's going to resist to the end. But the type of resistance that you saw in the 50s, like trying to hold on to the old ways, the old South, you don't really see that. So it's a mixed bag. But Title II, Title VII, major interventions. Also, the Attorney General can now sue if laws are not being enforced. And so there are a set of enforcement measures at last, which the Justice Department now have at their disposal.
And, that all sounds obvious, and it sounds like such a no-brainer when we're talking about, these changes nowadays. But there's also a real difference, isn't there, between establishing a legal framework for civil equality versus racism. And just because you have the former, the latter doesn't disappear. People that might have been racist before the Civil Rights Act was passed are not suddenly going to feel any different just because it is. What was the immediate kind of impact and fallout of the Civil Rights Act? Did it actually make a difference?
Yeah, as I was saying, it did make a difference, and it did that, providing that legal framework for desegregation, for full equality and citizenship rights, so under the law, was really significant. But Althea also, pointed out that there were some real limitations with that. So that, we've kind of already alluded to this, but the Voting Rights Act has to come a year after. Numerous voter registration campaigns, but particularly the Selma campaign, which is kind of now been memorialized as a film, right? Which I think is actually really good kind of depiction of what was going on and why that needed to happen as well. So this legislative framework was important and it needed to be built upon. And again, activists had to go into the streets and lobby politicians to ensure that the actual real and meaningful change happened. So that was really significant. But I think we always have to be a little bit wary of, and this is not to downplay any of the kind of actions of civil rights activists, but to be wary of the potential of civil rights and to always kind of understand its limitations, right? So there was a general kind of consensus amongst moderates and progressives that some form of civil rights legislation should and needed to happen in the United States. And again, that was pushed by the activists themselves. But there were kind of limitations and kind of broader calls for human rights were often kind of marginalized, saying the kind of idea well, you've got citizenship, you've got voting rights. What more do you want? We're all on an equal playing field now. But we can see, right, even from, let's take voting rights, 2013 Shelby County versus Holder kind of reverses some of the key aspects of the voting rights bill, we can always kind of backslide. But also these bigger demands for jobs, for educational opportunities, for kind of reform of other key systems and tackling systemic racism in other areas, those have kind of fallen by the wayside. And very much, I think, the attitude from white liberals, white moderates, progressives tends to be, well, you've got your Civil Rights Act, we don't need to do anything else. So obviously, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, doesn't spell the end of racial discrimination in America. It's a really, really important kind of legislative framework, but activists need to kind of keep pushing and keep challenging various forms of systemic racism for years to come, right? And that's still very much an ongoing process today.
Yeah, so, Nick has outlined that there were some really important changes here, but we know that some of these changes were slightly more on the obvious side, like outlawing racial segregation in public accommodations. And for many activists, this was already on its way out, was already being dismantled. Activists had really challenged that, and businesses weren't able to sustain that constant wave of activists challenging racial segregation in public accommodations. And the government were largely not supportive because of that Cold War context, which Nick has laid out for us. And so there were other aspects which the Act did not engage with, which activists are pushing for. And some of those are super obvious. So, for instance, where's housing? Major area in which discrimination is rife and absolutely speaks to the heart of people's quality of life, that right to housing, to shelter. And there's nothing in the Civil Rights Act about that. There's still states in the US where interracial marriage is unlawful. So there are issues around marriage. That's not addressed in the Civil Rights Act. And a range of economic practices, discriminatory economic practices around credit, i.e. getting a mortgage, for instance, issues of redlining. Those economic issues are also not covered by the Civil Rights Act. So there's a lot of stuff that's left out, which are urgent, that are desperately needed, that activists in that moment were saying, we need to address this. So yes, there's some patting on the back, but there are some obvious omissions in that civil rights bill.
You mentioned, like mortgages, for instance, and as someone who's worked at a bank for several years, I think it's so difficult to just put the Civil Rights Act into law and assume that suddenly that's, going to fix something like the mortgage market, which is so algorithm driven. And when you've created this sort of systemic inequality where African Americans generally at this point are sitting on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, that's going to mean that they don't suddenly get approved for mortgages that they didn't get approved for yesterday, because other things have to change. And another thing that I picked up on is, you both mentioned, employment law and sort of the Civil Rights Act in the workplace. That's where I think it does get more discretionary, doesn't it? Because, if you've got a hiring manager and you've got two candidates applying for a job, one of them is a white man, one of them is a black man, and they're both equally qualified. Everything on paper is the same. If that person is just inherently prejudiced, they're still going to pick the white guy. So, really embedding the ideological changes off the back of the Civil Rights Act, that takes time. That takes generations even, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's going to be until the 1970s that Congress will start to address some of those financial practices, which is stopping African Americans from accumulating wealth. Buying a home is the number one asset for regular folk to build wealth, and African Americans are denied that. And so we've seen the effects of not being able to buy a home because the government is being obstructive, and the impact that has on wealth gaps today. You see wage gaps today. So for every 76 cents that a Black American makes, that is in comparison to $1 for their white counterpart. All of those things have legacies. But you're right to say, what about those shifts, those ideological shifts? I would just say that activists are pretty clear in the moment that this is not a hearts and minds campaign. This is about human rights. So they are using white sympathy, white engagement in very strategic ways. It's part of the process in order to gain human rights, and a range of civil rights is part of that as well. The mission was never to change white people's hearts or minds, even as philosophically some folks like King talked about things like redemptive suffering, the power of love. But we do need to think of these as strategies rather than the goal. There is nevertheless, when you discriminate, legally you can discriminate against the population, that encourages stigma. And so I think we have seen less stigma in certain areas. I think that's important. But racism, as Stokely Carmichael, famously said, racism is about power. It's not about attitude. So changing attitudes is not the point. Breaking a power system is the point. And that work continues to this day.
And Nick, what do you see as being one of the sort of the legacies, of the Civil Rights Act? Because I think we've acknowledged there's still a lot of inequality, not just in America but in the world. So what mark has it left?
Yeah, I think it's created those images and those actions live on. It creates a sense of possibility that things can change, and also the need for a reminder of the need of continuous struggle, which is why it's so important how we teach and learn about the civil rights movement. That we don't see it as a time where there was a better America where everyone kind of came together and everyone agreed to get these things done. There were some really interesting cross-racial collaborations, and people who you didn't expect to kind of take up the banner of civil rights took up the banner of civil rights. But it was a much more kind of complex, it was a much more kind of contested and an unpopular movement, as we've talked about before on previous podcast episodes. But there's a really kind of nice quote from Alice Walker, which I, again, sometimes kind of use in teaching, and I kind of dredged up for today's episode, where she says, so Alice Walker, the African-American novelist, most famously The Color Purple, she says, because of the movement, and she's talking specifically about the 1960s movement, because of an awakened faith in the newness and imagination of the human spirit, because of black and white together, because of beatings, the arrests, the hell of battle during the past years, I have fought harder for my life and for a chance to be myself, to be something more than a shadow or a number than I have ever done in my life. So here you have someone looking back on that moment and saying, this is what it means to me. And that sense of continuous struggle, I think, is really important. This is a moment that, yes, to cherish and to celebrate, but let's kind of do justice to the people who went out and put their bodies and their lives on the line in order to challenge segregation.
This act and the work, the grassroots work that went into getting to this moment, as Nick pointed out, alongside a lot of governmental maneuvering and action as well, has led to an expansion of rights. This is an important template for other expansion of rights. Rights that protect maternity, rights that protect, age discrimination, a range of LGBTQ rights as well. This legislation really leads the way to open up and to be a template, and an expansion of the Civil Rights Act has now gone far beyond race, where we see protections for things like gender identity as well. And so it is really part of a rights revolution and an important moment of rights expansion for all peoples. And it has its international effect as well. Our race relation acts in the UK, folks are engaging with the legislation that's passed in the US. They're reading the actual legislation and also are being informed about, well, how might some of this or some of the language or some of the rights that are being put forward and legislated, how might we put that or use that, or how might it inspire our legislation? And so it is an act that has gone beyond its borders and certainly beyond race, colour and national origin.
Yeah, thank you both. That's it's been fascinating to learn more, and it feels like we're prematurely ending this episode when I think I've got a couple of years worth of, of other topics that I could touch on here. But we are going to wrap up this particular episode for now. Thank you so much to both Nick and Althea for joining me. And if you want to find out more about some of the things that we've chatted about on this episode, I'm going to put some useful links in the show notes, so check that out as well. If anyone wants to connect with either of you, where can they do that, Althea?
I'm super old fashioned, so you're going to have to dust off your email. So do my institutional email. You'll be able to Google that. Just put my name in and send me an email. Sorry, folks.
No, I love how old school that is.
Fancy Twitter and your handle and all of that stuff now. But yeah, old fashioned email.
Yeah, I love it. Nick?
Yeah, I'm still just about on Twitter. Nicholas G. Grant is my handle. But yeah, so yeah, tweet me or email me. But particularly if you're kind of learning about the civil rights movement at school, or you it's part of like your syllabus. Like historians are often really happy to answer questions from people doing their GCSEs, A levels, or whatever mode of study that you're doing if you're not based in the UK. So yeah, do reach out to me or and others that you find, and I'm sure most people will reply to you. I
think they're going to X you though.
X, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even Althea knows the terminology now. Come on, Nick.
I do.
And yeah, you can find me on X as well via This Is the Hef, and on LinkedIn, just search for Liam Heffernan, which is my name. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a rating and a review wherever you're listening to this. It helps other people find the show, which is super useful. And give us a follow as well, so that all future episodes appear in your feed. Thanks again, and goodbye.